Uh, I've done videos like this before, but I wanted to make one on basically on defense. The whole topic itself would be too big to do one video, so in this I just wanted to talk about three myths about government defense. The first that I like to point out is the widespread belief that defense is a public good, which is just a economic way of saying that it's non-excludable. There's been a lot of debate on YouTube that defense is something that's a non-excludable good, that if you are defending yourself or that you have some kind of defensive plan, that you are then defending others, and so there's no incentive for anybody to defend themselves because whether you pay or not, you will be defended. And similar to all other supposed public goods, this really doesn't make a lot of sense. If you think about just the idea that if you do something, if there's something you need, that you're not going to do it because giving it to yourself would mean somebody else would do it. I don't know of any examples of that actually happening. Clear, at least free market ones where that actually happens. I think the main thing that it misses is even if other people gain ancillary benefits from your actions, you will gain more benefits from your actions. So when it comes to defense, I think a really good analog to this would be gun ownership. There is evidence, although I don't know exactly how conclusive it is, that civilian ownership of guns reduces crime. And it may very well be true that if most of your neighbors have guns, or if a large proportion of them have guns, that it'd be very unlikely that you'll ever be robbed because you live in that neighborhood and people realize that's a bad neighborhood. I think this is evident whenever a homeowner shoots like a burglar. It is unlikely that that neighborhood will be robbed, whether the other owners own guns or not, anytime near in the future. And you could say, well, then nobody's ever going to own a gun because what's the point? You'll be defended if just some people own guns, and guns are expensive. They can cost hundreds of dollars, and if you want to actually know how to use them, it takes time, and you have to keep buying bullets, and you probably need to get at least a minimal amount of ancillary equipment. And the reason people do it is because that even if you're owning a gun confers some level of benefit on others, you get even more benefit. In the event that you are actually attacked, you have the option then to use the gun, whereas the person who is relying on the ancillary benefits of you having owned it doesn't have that option. And when it comes to defense, I think this is pretty much still the case. If you want to build a bomb shelter, if you want to have a place to store your valuables, if you want to have a stock of food or a stock of supplies, you are more likely and more able to benefit from that than are others, even if they benefit in an ancillary way. Like an example, as a bomb shelter, if you survive because you have a bomb shelter, then you're around to possibly help your neighbors. And so you could say, well, they benefit then from you having a bomb shelter. In fact, you might even let your neighbors use your bomb shelter, and then they would essentially be having it for free. But then you would have more options than they would. You would be able to exclude them from that. For one thing, you might not even let them know that you have it. You could set the terms and conditions of its use. I think another area that most people have overlooked is if you form some kind of defensive pact, either in a company of some type, a defense organization. I think that those have been overemphasized by a lot of free market advocates. Not that we can predict for sure. I'm just guessing that they would be less common. But if you form some kind of militia or from some kind of private, what would amount to a gang, membership in that would confer benefits. If you have some kind of system of, if you get attacked, call me and we'll send out the call and we'll all show up to protect you, people who aren't on the list won't get the protection, and it will be too bad for you, or good luck anyway. So even though organizations like that might confer some general benefit, they have a greater specific benefit on the people who are actually paying for and hence controlling them. I mean, if you're actually controlling, paying for it, then you have a great deal more say over people who are just getting ancillary benefits. So that's one. It's not a public good. It is excludable, and so that's the first myth. The second one is a little bit more vague, and I think it's more of a conceptual one, and that is the fact that people tend not to assess the defensive good or service in marginal units, which is what they should. There's a tendency to aggregate all the activities that the government performs as a singular monolith, and then to say you or I or a small group of people could never hope to fund or support such a gargantuan effort. Hence, it requires the coercion, aka the taxation of the entire society to support. And the problem here is we could make that same argument by aggregating everything for every industry. I could say, look at the food industry. We have millions and millions of acres requiring really trillions of dollars worth of capital if you really factor in all the storage and all the equipment that has to be maintained and built. It's reliant on literally centuries of accumulation, thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, creating basically an unknown quantity of different products, producing them, preparing them, shipping them, distributing them to a huge population of hundreds of millions of people who all have different wants and different tastes and who move around all the time, who have evolving and changing tastes. We could aggregate that and say it's this impossibly complex industry, and to say you or I or a couple libertarians in this hamlet would never be able to create a system like that on our own. Well, sure. And people make this mistake with defense. If the government actually defends you, like if say you know our country gets attacked, the government is not going to allocate all the resources of the state to defend you. They might, and this is actually kind of ridiculous because they never actually do this. That would be the third myth, but I'll get to that in a minute. They might send, say, a squad of soldiers, and they'll have some arms, and maybe they'll have a tank or something. But then you're talking about that's all that's defending you is a finite little tiny slice, and all of a sudden at that point the incomprehensibly expensive defense service that people talk about is really just a couple guys with guns. And actually, if you divide it out, the degree to which each and every person is defended is actually a pretty small amount of money. Well, that gets back to myth 3 again. I'll come to that still later. It's also, people say, well, sure, yeah, you can afford a gun, you can afford a bulletproof vest, and maybe you can afford some type of equipment, but if that's all there's going to be, then that's not enough. And sure, if you're saying in the entire United States we have 300 million people, if nobody does anything for their defense and just a few people do, and those few people are only going to have a tiny little bit of defense. But there again, if we have only a few people, I mean, you're moving the goalposts and changing multiple variables here, because if we have a whole society and none of them want defense, and then we have a state that likewise only has a couple people, and that state doesn't magically have the ability to marshal giant air forces or navies or huge armies. It has only what it can tax, and it's not going to be any more. In fact, it will be less because the state is so wasteful and self-consuming. So the idea that, and then comes this, how do we know people are going to want? People will spend money and invest in whatever they think that they need. And if we're in a situation where nobody in the entire continental United States wants to spend anything on defense, then I think it's a valid question to ask whether they need to or not. You know, it's very common historically for the state to think we need to go to war and the people not to. And that doesn't, there's this tendency among historians to just always defer and say if President Roosevelt or President Wilson thought we should go to war, then we should have gone to war. And the fact that Americans, by and large, didn't want to go to war, that just shows how stupid and behind the times they are. When really, it should throw some doubt onto the wisdom, so-called, of the leaders. And really, especially in the case of FDR, and I'm just picking on him, but I could pick who knows how many historical examples. Their desire to go to war has only the most tenuous and dubious link to any kind of plausible public good. Usually there's some degree of egomania involved, or just some kind of conceited belief in their own greatness, or bad economics. I mean, Hitler, for one, he was an autocrat. He pretty much figured if they didn't have a nation state that controlled all the resources that they needed, that they'd be doomed, which is wrong. And yet that's the basis for him going to war with everybody. That's pretty dubious. And so these scenarios that people make are pretty unlikely. If there's really a threat, if people are really worried, say we live in anarcho-capitalist land, and there are still violent states around that are likely to attack, or violent pirates, or violent gangs, or aggressive anarcho-capitalist societies, why would we then assume that, oh, all the people here are just going to blithely be unaware of that or not care about that? People are living and they're investing and they have property and they have lives and plans, and they feel that those are threatened. They will act. Now, how exactly that will manifest, we can't predict for sure. But then to have it be, oh, well, you couple people are never going to be able to fund an army. Yeah, but if everyone in the society is talking about managing their own defense, then every single little place is going to have its defense figured out, and it's not this scenario where you're only talking about the resources of a tiny population versus the concentrated resources of an entire society. So you have to think of things in terms of marginal units, just like you do for medicine or food or cars. The same arguments that allege that defense is this incalculably expensive public good could be used to say that everything needs to be nationalized, because everything we could aggregate into some all-encompassing, mind-bogglingly, prohibitively expensive industry. Now, the third and final one that I'd like to mention is the basic fact that if you really analyze the actions of governments, the claim that they are actually there to defend you is pretty dubious. And the only real two pieces of evidence that you can say to support the claim that they are there to defend us is, one, their own claims to that effect, which again, politicians especially are notoriously not honest, I guess would be the most charitable way to say it. They're liars, and so why we would then accept their assertion to be, if they say they're doing something, then just to accept that at face value, I don't think that that can be taken for granted. But the corroborating evidence that people put in is that, well, look, here's an act that the government's doing. This act will either did or would protect some of the citizenry, hence governments do protect their citizens. And I will admit that that as an ancillary component of how states act, that sometimes happen, but I would say that the degree that they defend or protect their citizens is only to the degree that coincides with their own plans and desires. For instance, if a state thinks that it needs a certain industrial area, that it needs the output of certain factories, if it needs the manpower of a certain region, then they may very likely defend that area. And then you could say, well, they're defending the populace, but they're defending it because it's in their interest. This would be very similar to, say, a king who lives in a castle, but he has a town around it, who builds walls around the town, and you can say, look, he's protecting the people, but he's protecting himself, and it's just an accident, or maybe not an accident, but it just happens to be also the case that includes helping the person. But so it's not enough to say, look, they've done something and people have been protected, because to really come to the conclusion of whether they're acting in their interests primarily or those of the people, as they allege, at least most of them allege most of the time, I guess there's a couple who haven't actually lied, is to say, what do they decide to do when their interests conflict with those of the populace at large? You know, what does the government do when its interests are at odds with those of the populace? Because if they're there for our protection, if they're there for our own good, then they will choose the betterment of society at large to their own detriment. And this is a slightly problematic line of reasoning, because it can almost always be argued when people have a worldview based on things like the common good, to define it anyway, and to say, okay, so what if Stalin is a megalomaniac and sacrifices millions of people for his own personal good? He's the embodiment of the fatherland, and that's for the common good. You know, so what if millions die defending a city that just happens to have his name, which is actually not the only reason that happened, but just as an example, one could plausibly argue that, well, that's really what that really is for the common good. But of course, that argument, that's a knife that cuts both ways, because then we could say, if your whole basis for claiming that what the government's doing is great is so nebulous as to be so indefinite that it can't be proven or disproven, then it's not evidence to the efficacy of states. But I think you can make a very strong case that in any number of areas that clearly government always picks its own interests over those, or what could plausibly be considered the interests of everybody else. And this demonstrates that the defense is not there for the society at large, but for the government. And if we wanted to list examples, there'd be quite a few. And I'm not sure, I couldn't list them all, but just for example, one would be the extreme tendency of states, I don't care what states, where democratic, monarchical, dictatorial, communist, fascist, to lie to their populace, to misrepresent either the causes for or the nature of or the course of a war or its cost. They always lie about the costs too. And if they were really interested in the well-being of the populace, they would be frank and say, this is what's really happening. You need to know this because we need to know if that's what you really want. They never do that. They always hide what they're really doing and how things are really progressing. What does this say? Nothing. Okay. Another thing is, it could be argued that at least in some circumstances, and I think actually in quite a few, that the bureaucratic nature of militaries is highly counterproductive. They're very, very wasteful, they're very, very top-heavy, and they're not very adaptable. And you could say, well, why don't they just allow the military commanders and the military soldiers to have more autonomy and have them be able to react better and to use their own intuition and their own like on-the-ground experience to adapt to situations, and we can avoid things like World War I, where they just keep beating a dead horse and killing millions of men. Wouldn't there be an argument for this? Because there's a lot of evidence that a decentralized organization gets a lot more bang for its buck. You just use, like, say, the Native Americans with practically no capital compared to the regular Americans, and yet we're able to consistently beat them. Or like the Iraqi insurgents, or in Afghanistan, or we could go on and on and on with examples here of how a decentralized system is very cost effective. The government will never, ever, ever consider that, because the number one priority in a military is obedience, even if that means defeat. I mean, there are examples where governments would, if you would say, okay, well, let the military become better, more victorious, but as a result, it would be less amenable to your commands, they will never do that. They will always allow the military to be less effective, more prone to defeat, if that will keep them obedient, because that's the number one thing they have to be obedient to the wishes of the government, to the state, because that's what they really serve. That's the real point. And of course, there's other anecdotes as to why the government's really defending itself and not us. The example I like to give, and I've given it before, is that of, say, underground bunkers or like nuclear facilities. We know that the U.S. government has some of these facilities. We don't know their scope or how many. We also know that if you or I, if there ever was some kind of apocalypse or Holocaust or nuclear war, that if you or I ever attempted to seek shelter in a place like this, that we would most likely be killed, or at the very least be turned away, as people are currently turned away or even threatened to be killed. I don't know that it's actually ever happened on any number of secret installations now. This demonstrates, I think, pretty clearly that they are there to serve the interests of the state and not there to serve the interests of the public. It is the president who gets a Marine to follow him around with a lead jacket and EMP defended Air Force One, and to see who gets all the bodyguards. It is the state that gets all the defense, and we are all secondary to this. And when there are wars, even just popular ones like World War II, sorry, I should not have said just, popular wars like World War II, the state's interests clearly supersede those of the people. The people are subordinated to the state to the degree that is absolutely counterfactual to speak of the state serving the people in any meaningful way. The people are subservient to the state for the state's ends, whatever those are. And I mean, this I think is the biggest myth, because people can talk about, well, hypothetically, hypothetically the state's going to protect us, but the state's not going to protect us. It has no legal authority or legal obligation to. You can't call. I mean, just imagine if Red Dawn happened right now and Chinese or Russian paratroopers started appearing, landing around here, shooting people up. There's no hotline you can call and have the military show up. And if there was, say you call them and say, hey, we're being attacked, you think that they're going to come and protect you? No. No, they're not going to do that at all. It's the degree that the government protects its people is the same degree that a shepherd protects a sheep. Yes, they protect them from lions and from other predators, but that's only so that they have them available when they want to shear them or to slaughter them or do whatever they want with them. It would be wrong to say shepherds are there to protect sheep. Shepherds are there to preserve sheep for their own use. And governments, yes, jealously guard their tax cattle from other governments most of the time. But that is only so that they can despoil them all the more thoroughly themselves, which they do. Their plans for their defense do not display any kind of how are we going to defend all the civilians, how are we going to defend the whole citizenry. It's how is the state going to continue to function. And when they pass all this legislation in the Cold War about continuity of government, it's continuity of government, continuity of government. How is the government going to survive? It's explicitly in the language of the bill. But people don't, put two and two together and think, oh, they're taxing us. We're taxed billions and billions of dollars, trillions of dollars actually. And the main purpose is to make sure that they are defended and that they are powerful. And sure, some of us might get lucky and fall into their orbit and maybe live because of it. Sure, that can happen. There's no denying that. That's not a service at all, and it's a very crappy kind of thing to count on. So those are the three myths: marginal utility, or the marginal pricing of units, the fact that they don't actually defend us, they defend themselves, and that we're just there to serve them. And what was the first one? I don't remember now. Yeah. That's it. I mean, states are absolutely terrible at defense, and I will say this is something that I became kind of aware of a long time before I was a market anarchist, just by reading regular history books, not biased ones by anarcho-capitalists. There aren't any anarcho-capitalist history books. When you're a history buff, you have to read regular history, which is fine. It's just a lot of it's laced with Marxist bullshit, and a lot of historians are state worshippers, and they don't even know it because that's what they study is the state, the state, the state, the state, the state. When they write a history of a society, it's all about the state, and then the back chapters like, oh, here's the non-state stuff. But it's clear when you study history that states are acting in their interest, not in the interest of others or their people. The Tsar, he ostensibly is going to claim that he's there for Mother Russia, but all the spending is for his event. All the defense is for him and his capital and his cronies, not for everyone else. So, and I just use them as an example. We go on and on and on. There are examples of militaries and state apparatus or apparati that don't serve the interests of the state and do attempt to serve the interests of the people. The only ones I know about are cases when they start to literally disobey and ignore the dictates of the state. The best example I can think of that is in World War II towards the end. The Nazi state was basically ordering all of its soldiers and all of its military forces to continue to fight as tenaciously as possible. To their credit, many German soldiers, through all levels of rank, knew that the war was lost, and they started to think of, well, what's going to happen after the war, and many of them, I think probably all of them, realized completely correctly that the Soviets were many thousands of times, I don't mean that in hyperbole, worse than, say, the English or the Americans, and that it would be the best way for this war to end would be for as many Germans to be either occupied by or escape to the Allies as opposed to the Russians. And so despite what their government was saying, the German soldiers who were fighting the Allies, especially very late in the war, basically just started to give up in mass, to not fight back, to let them conquer as much as possible so that they would then prevent the Russians from taking over and then mass raping, killing, and gulagging everybody. Well, the soldiers in the East continued to resist much longer and much fiercer in order to stem that invasion. So in that situation, you could say, look, the German army is acting not in the interest of the government, but actually in the interest of the people. And I would agree with that. I also would say that, yeah, and in doing that, it is explicitly disobeying the government. It is severing its connection to the authority of the state in order to serve. There are other examples of that. I can't think of too many others, really, but that almost proves my point, because it's when they disobey and thwart the state's actions that they start to actually do something that could plausibly be considered for the common good for the people. And that's what the definition of the common good that just doesn't accept government dictates is axiomatically true. I mean, that's a whole other argument. So anyway, 3 myths about government provision of defense services.